I being projected? I think I'm being projected. I was told I need to tuck the cord into the pocket by my wife. All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Reverend Seth and the committee that is in charge of this for inviting me to come and speak today. I will do my best not to fall too short of the billing the good Reverend gave me during service. I will say that this is not my particular area of expertise. It is a phenomenon that I have been aware of and reading about and talking about in more truncated form than I'll get into today in various parts of the classes that I teach. You can't teach American government with talking about political polarization at least a little bit. But this, I'm trying to think, is I think the first time in which polarization will be the sole subject of a talk that I'm giving. So it's been a nice opportunity for me to focus in on this particular subject. Before I get into some of the factors that explain polarization, I want to offer a couple caveats. Polarization is not new, as the near-fatal caning of Charles Sumner by Senator Preston Brooks in the U.S. Senate can attest. We have been in difficult situations before. We made it through the 1850s. My guess is we'll make it through the 2020s. Of course, one might say the 1860s is a point of time that we would like to avoid. I don't think the 2030s will see us at civil war with each other. But there is cause for concern if we're not likely to enter into full-blown civil war. It is not beyond the realm of possibility from my perspective that we could enter into a period characterized by, let's say, the troubles of Northern Ireland of the last half century, in which politics becomes increasingly sectarian in character. And political scientists are starting to talk about our politics as sectarian, in which there is a kind of faith in one's politics that animates a kind of intensity of feeling. And so, kind of toxic relationships and sporadic violence and terrorism motivated by politics is certainly possible. Politics, of course, is inherently conflictual. We can conceptualize politics in different ways. The classic definition in Western civilization comes to us from the Greek tradition, classical Greece. Politics is this kind of project of bringing justice about, and that's kind of this noble enterprise. But Plato, if we take his definition of justice just as an example, Plato argued that justice is bringing a community into harmony, right? Harmonizing the various components that are in conflict with each other. So there is this acknowledgement of conflict, even in that kind of not classical noble definition of politics. If we adopt a more modern definition of politics, and in the Western tradition, Machiavelli is a good place to start from that perspective. Politics is the search for acquiring power and the successful implementation and retention of power. Obviously, that involves a fair amount of conflict. Regardless of our particular conception of politics, how we practice politics is particularly important. The degree and intensity of conflict can vary. I'd like to show you how. So that we perhaps can take some control over our subjunctive possibilities in the decades to come. Some attention to the indicative factual circumstances of the present matters. All right, so what polarization is, political scientists at this point characterize American polarization as affective polarization, which means essentially Democrats aren't in love with the Democratic Party, the Republicans aren't in love with the Republican Party, so much as intensifying hostility towards the other is what seems to be driving them apart. And so that explains to a point the hard feelings that exist in the political culture today, and it is particularly dangerous, a point I'll develop by the end of the presentation. It's complicated. There are different kinds of components to it. It's manifold in nature. There is a political dimension that is clearly political. It is perhaps the aspect of polarization that we are most used to thinking about. So ideology, liberalism, and conservatism seem to be increasingly characteristic of the two parties. For a long time, the parties were fairly heterogeneous, ideologically speaking. That is to say, you could find plenty of conservatives and liberals in the Democratic Party, and you could find plenty of conservatives and liberals in the Republican Party. But there's been a great deal of sorting in the last 50 to 70 years or so. And so increasingly, the Democratic Party is a liberal entity, and the Republican Party is a conservative one. Partisanship isn't purely ideological. Partisanship is an attachment to a group for all sorts of social reasons, cultural reasons, familial reasons as well. And then another component of politics is just competition for stuff. Political scientist Jerald famously defined politics as the process of figuring out who gets what and how. And so different kinds of groups in society are competing for limited resources, and that, of course, is going to generate a certain amount of conflict. Another component, however, of polarization is psychological and a function of social psychology. Human beings associate with groups. Much of our individual identity stems from and flows from a connection to other people. And there's ample amounts of evidence at this point to demonstrate how individuals come to have a preference for their groups, in-group preference bias, and a kind of hostility towards other groups. That seems natural. It emerges really quickly in the process of child development, and when psychologists do their experiments to kind of test the limits of this psychological propensity, they find that it doesn't matter, that the particular group that you are aligned with doesn't matter in terms of you developing an in-group preference or an out-group. You can assign college students, they're typically the guinea pigs in psychological studies, you can assign them to arbitrary groups that are made up, and they will still develop an in-group preference bias for that arbitrary group. So that's part of what's going on. Out-group aversion seems to be important. And of course, race and ethnicity in a multicultural, diverse society is some of the groups in which these preference and aversion biases are manifesting. And then, of course, there's culture, right? Culture is fueling our polarization. Rural and urban divides seem to be particularly important in explaining the lines of division within political cultures. And we might characterize this as a kind of parochialism, a commitment to local place, an identification with a particular kind of place, versus a cosmopolitanism, a comfort level with a variety or diversity of cultural traditions and so forth. Religion is also particularly important. I'll talk briefly about that. And educational attainment and economic class. I'm going to come to economic class later in the presentation as a way of both trying to explain part of the driving polarization in these other areas, but also, hopefully, potentially a way to try to reduce some of that polarization. All right, so political scientists have for a long time agreed that polarization is a reality at the elite level, and by elite, I mean office holders, politicians, political activists, people who are engaged actively in trying to shape politics. And we need to think a little bit about the historical roots of partisan realignment in the last half century in order to really kind of fully understand why we are where we're at right now. If we look at the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and their role in the civil rights movement, these administrations were really effectively forced off the sideline by the civil rights movements of the time to support passage of the landmark statutes that the Civil Rights Act was aiming for, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And both Kennedy and Johnson were reluctant to do so for very understandable reasons, the key one being that the Democratic Party depended heavily on the South for votes. The historical connection between the Democratic Party and the southern region of the United States is strong and clear. Southern white conservatives strongly identified with the Democratic Party. And of course, by embracing the civil rights movement and the larger project of racial desegregation, Kennedy and Johnson knew full well that they're going to create a significant division within their party. And so this begins the process of significant realignment for Southern white conservatives, leaving the Democratic Party and moving to the Republican Party in a limited way at first and slowly overall. So in a limited way means that Southern white conservatives started to vote for Republicans at the presidential level. Nixon's Southern strategy reflects that. And then voting Democratic down the rest of the ticket. But eventually that kind of limited kind of relationship with the Republican Party became increasingly full. And of course, on the other side, you see liberal Republicans beginning to leave the Republican Party, particularly in the Northeast of the country, and shifting to the Democratic Party. And so that kind of explains, to an extent, some of the ideological sorting, the loss of liberals in the Republican Party and the loss of conservatives in the Democratic Party. And then in the 1970s, we have the emergence of some kind of new, certainly up to that point, less prominent economic theories. Milton Friedman, professor of economics, kind of the driver of the Chicago School of Economics, provides a kind of intellectual counterweight to Keynesian economics. So John Maynard Keynes is the economist that gives the theoretical justification for projects like the New Deal in the 1930s to respond to the business cycle through government spending to stimulate the economy into a growth cycle rather than contraction. And that perspective really dominates in the 1930s and the 40s and 50s and 60s. Even Richard Nixon at one point says, we're all Keynesians at this point. The difference is how much of a Keynesian are we? But Friedman and the kind of the emergence and revitalization of a more conservative economics in the 1970s really kind of reorients many people's thinking about the relationship between governments and markets, right? And so one response in an economic downturn in the business cycle would be to increase government spending to stimulate economic activity. Another response might be to lower taxes and cut regulations in order to free up money so that consumers and businesses can spend and thus stimulate economic activity. So this kind of new tool in the policy toolbox, so to speak, of political leaders explains a little bit of drifting apart on the subject of polarization. Of course, there's lots of social changes in the 1960s, so we get not just the civil rights movement, but the gay rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, counterculture in general. All kind of creates a kind of turbulence in the period that ends up politicizing people both on the left and on the right. And so you see the emergence of organizations dedicated to a kind of reaction to these larger cultural movements of the period. So the Heritage Foundation is a conservative group dedicated to the promotion of conservative values and conservative policy. Is founded in 1973. The Moral Majority is founded by Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and Paul Weyrich in 1979. The Federalist Society organization dedicated to a kind of conservative view of the Constitution and an interpretation of the Constitution through a kind of perspective of the founders returning a jurisprudence to a more classical liberal viewpoint rather than a more modern one. And that, of course, is consistent with conservative rejection of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade. And then the focus on the family in 1987, again, promoting cultural conservative values. In addition to these kind of social movements, there is a reaction to some of the laws that are passed as a result of these social movements. And so a good example would be the emergence of environmental law in the 1960s and the 1970s. Laws like that are often termed by historians of policy as new social regulation. And a kind of key difference from the regulations and laws that are passed in this period relative to laws prior is that the federal government, when the New Deal comes out, the federal government is trying to expand regulation and expand government interaction with the marketplace in ways to stimulate economic activity, right? The whole point of the New Deal is to strengthen and expand the economy. And in the 60s and 70s with environmental regulation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in particular, the point is to change the nature of production within the economy, and that has the effect of making production more expensive and contracting the economy. And so this generates a fair amount of opposition. These are laws that were popular at the outset. The Endangered Species Act passed the Senate 99-0. But as the costs of compliance become increasingly clear, you begin to see the emergence of opposition to these laws. So industry and business is becoming increasingly organized over the course of the 1970s to push back against this form of legislation. Those are very popular laws, and business and industry quickly realized, look, we're not going to repeal the Clean Air Act. But what we can do, they decided, was to try to limit its implementation, to push back on the rigor of the standards that were being created, so as to make the regulatory burden lighter and then the cost of compliance lighter. And for that, litigation is a particularly important pathway. And so you can see the connection between the emergence of an organization like the Federalist Society and the interests of business in trying to lighten the load of regulatory compliance. And of course, affirmative action and anti-discrimination policies, such as the Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, are pushing back against the ability of the private sector to serve people of a different race, to hire people of a different race, to promote them, and so forth. And all of that is taking place in the midst of our attempts to desegregate. And you can understand, right, the controversy around some of these, and it becomes a vehicle for a mobilization on the right. When we get to the 1980s, we see the end of the Fairness Doctrine, the Federal Communications Commission requiring news outlets that talk about politics to give equal time to each side. That ends in the middle of the 1980s. We get new technology, the internet, and so forth, that give rise to a very, very explicitly political media, media outlets for whom a particular political perspective is the primary or dominant mode of communication. And so what this means, and then we're going to add social media to it, right? Facebook and Twitter, all kind of give American individuals the opportunity to immerse themselves in a perspective that is affirming of their own perspectives. And this, in some sense, is like injecting steroids into a cognitive bias. All human beings are prone to certain kinds of cognitive biases, confirmation bias being one of them. We are all happy to find evidence that supports what we think about the world. It is, in some sense, confirming our viewpoint. We feel, oh, aren't I smart? I was right all along. There is this tendency to be less critical than we should be about information that supports our own perspective. The flip side of confirmation bias is disconfirmation bias. When we encounter data that seems to run counter to what we think is true, well, then, of course, then we become critical thinkers. We're like, oh, well, what's wrong with this study, right? Was their methods appropriate, and what are the limitations of their findings, and so forth. And so there's a way to kind of rationalize your way out of information that is challenging your worldviews. And so the internet has given us, massive amounts of access to incredible amounts of information. The Library of Congress can be tapped in through your phone now at this point. That's a wonderful thing. There's all sorts of potential positive elements to our access to information through the internet. But it comes with some real dangers, and those dangers are that it accelerates or amplifies the possibility of confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias. And there's no doubt in my mind at this point that social media and the internet have helped push us away from the center. And so if we look, I will explain this. This is a bit of data charting how close the two parties are to one another. It's put together by a handful of political scientists, Keith Poole at University of Georgia, Howard Rosenthal at New York University, and Hare at UC Davis. And it's based on the public records. So we have public records of how all members of Congress vote. And we can compile those votes along an ideological scale to get an average for the Republican conference and the Democratic conference of every particular Congress, and track how the liberality of one party and the conservatism of another party change over time. And so high up the vertical axis, the y-axis, we see increasing difference between the two parties. Low towards the bottom of the vertical axis are periods of historical, we might call them agreement, right? Increasing consensus. And so we see in the 1920s and the 1930s a period of the two parties coming close together. The amount of difference between Democrats and Republicans in the Congress gets really rather small. It's not hard to think of historical events that would explain that. World Wars I and II, the Great Depression, all kind of create consensus around the need to respond to emergencies and to provide or present a united front. And then there's a fair amount of agreement through the 40s, 50s, and even 60s. In some sense, we can think about the Cold War as a binding sort of phenomenon. But also, this is a period of time in which the economy is growing very, very quickly. And we're seeing the rise of the middle class. The rise of the middle class in the late 40s and early 50s is an outcome of increased unionization and government policies such as the GI Bill that put servicemen and women to college, give them access to loans for home building. And so we see more and more people graduating college in the 50s, more and more people owning their own homes. And part of that is entrepreneurial activity in the marketplace, and part of it is policy driving it. So we get significant government infrastructure projects, for instance, the interstate highway system, big water projects out west, and power projects, and so forth. All right, so then we begin to see the two chambers of the Congress becoming more and more different by the time the 1980s roll around. And we are now moving into somewhat uncharted territory in terms of the real differences between Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate. So political scientists have agreed that polarization is a thing for the elites, but there was for a long time a debate about whether or not it was true of the masses. Our ordinary Americans also polarized. That debate is largely settled, and the answer is yes. This is longitudinal data put together by the Pew Research Center, measuring Americans, Republicans and Democrats, ordinary Republicans, ordinary Democrats, position on a liberal conservative scale that they construct on the basis of 10 questions that they consistently ask over time, so that we can attribute change to changes in the world rather than changes in the instrument, the measuring instrument. And so what we can see in 1994 is the distribution of ideological position taking by Democrats and Republicans. There's a lot of overlap. The median Democrat and the median Republican, very, very, very close together in 1994. Not a whole lot has changed in 2004, but by the time we get to 2017, you can clearly see the median positions for each party moving apart. And this is kind of reinforced if we just resort the data and compare the distributions for Republicans to the median Democrat. And in 1994, 64% of Republicans were more conservative than the median Democrat. In 2004, it ticks up to 70% of Republicans more conservative than the median Democrat. By 2017, 95% of Republicans are more conservative than the median Democrat. If we flip it over and look at the Democratic distributions, the same pattern presents itself. 70% of Democrats are more liberal than the median Republican in 1994. Essentially the same share is more liberal than the median Republican in 2004. But by 2017, again, 97% of Democrats are more liberal than the median Republican. So we're different, ideologically speaking, and that is kind of historically new. And it has effects, so a number of effects, one of which is voting behavior. So if we look at voting behavior, this is a figure that looks at the relative shares of House districts in terms of their voting for one party for both the House and presidency. So the dark blue bars there represent the share of districts in the years as they're listed on our y-axis. Those are the share of House districts that voted for Democrat for the House and for the president. The dark red bar represents the share of House districts that voted Republican for House and president. The lighter colors in the center there represent districts that are split. We call them split districts. Districts that vote Democrat for the House, but Republican for the president, as indicated by the light blue, and districts where the representative candidate is a Republican, but the Democratic preference is, or the House preference is Republican, the presidential preference is Democrat. So you can see what's relevant here is change. The change in particular is that by the time we get to 2020, the number of split districts has shrunk significantly, and the districts are behaving more consistently from a partisan perspective. The numbers here, 1992, the average number of split, since 92, the average number of split districts has been 70, but in 2020 it was 16. We can shift to Wisconsin and the correlation of presidential and state Supreme Court vote choice by county. So here, the vertical axis is the vote share in a county that went to the Republican candidate for president. In this one on the left in 1988, that would have been George Herbert Walker Bush. And then the horizontal axis, moving from left to right, is the vote share in that county that went to the Republican candidate for the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. And so what we would expect, right, if everybody is behaving as a good Democrat and a good Republican, is that nobody is in this lower right quadrant and nobody is in the upper left quadrant, that everybody occupies a quadrant on the lower left or the upper right. And the data doesn't show us that, right? The data shows us a dispersion that is indicative of a very, very weak relationship, if there's a relationship at all. It suggests that there are plenty of voters at the end of the 80s and early 90s willing to vote one way for one race and vote a different way for another race. Yes, sir. Going to get to gerrymandering in a minute, for sure that has to enter into it. Currently, right, this is the state Supreme Court race in 2020 and the presidential race in 2016, and the data just sorts itself into this nice tight line. This is telling us something. It's telling us that people are behaving consistently across different races on the ticket. Now you could say, well, why are all those dots on the right side of the red line represents 50%? So many counties voted for Daniel Kelly, the Republican candidate in the court race, and Janet Protasiewicz. She got fewer counties. What would account for that? They're not controlling for population, right? And so in a state race, some counties have lots of voters and some counties have few. And so if we look at the dispersion of votes controlling for population, we can see that Justice Protasiewicz wins the big populated counties overwhelmingly. Dan Kelly lost Dane County 18% to 82%. He lost Milwaukee County 27% to 73%. And so his victory in 45 of Wisconsin's 67 counties was for naught, right? Because you can't gerrymander a statewide race. There's just one fixed boundary. Locally, recent data also suggests there's not a whole lot of ticket splitting, probably. Protasiewicz won Whitefish Bay by almost 75%, and the Democrat for Senate District 8 won or lost, but she captured a comparable share of the vote here in Whitefish Bay. The Dan Kelly, the Republican, captured 25%, and the Republican senator who won the District 8 race also captured 25%. Now, there's possible, some shifting going on there, but it strikes me as highly unlikely that the percentages would be so comparable. All right, so now, what does gerrymandering have to do with all of this? First of all, the effect of gerrymandering is to reduce the competitiveness of the two parties within and across districts. It is an attempt to sort voters in a way that reduces competitiveness. The terminology is to pack your opponents, as many voters as you can, into a handful of districts. This is an inefficient use of voters. If you pack them into districts that they cannot lose and your party cannot win, but you don't care because the next step is cracking, that is to say, distributing the remainder of your opponent's voters across a number of districts such that they can't win a majority of the districts. And so Wisconsin, if we think about Wisconsin, is an electorate that is roughly 50-50. In 2016, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton for the president by, I think it was 7/10 of a percentage point. In 2020, Biden defeated Trump by 0.6 of a percentage point. There's a lot of parity. So, I'm not going to get into it too much, but another driver of polarization is the evenness of the two parties' strength at a national level, and in Wisconsin at the state level. And so giving anything to the other opposite side, right, is in some sense damaging your odds of winning the next cycle. And when there's a great deal of parity, everybody has a realistic chance of winning in the next cycle. So this disincentivizes bipartisanship. In 2012, Republicans won 48.6% of the votes cast for the state assembly that year, but that translated into 61% of the seats, right? And so in a 50-50, roughly 50-50 state, the Republicans have managed to capture 60 to 67, 68% of the legislative seats. Now, it needs to be conceded, right? If we go back to that map, Democrats cluster in urban areas, right? And so part of this is an outcome of voluntary residential choice. Democrats expose themselves to gerrymandering by clustering in urban areas. And by controlling the rural landscape, Republicans have a strategic advantage. So that's part of it. That's part of it. If we look at the House of Representatives, right, where gerrymandering also is relevant because they are, except for Wyoming, dividing up the states into smaller districts. The average margin of victory in contested House elections in 2022 was 28%. That's a big, big victory, right? That's the average. And the fact that there were a number of uncontested races tells us something about the competitiveness of House districts. If we look at the share of House races in 2022 that were very close, and by very close, we can operationalize it as 5% or less, only 8% of races were that close. And if we expand our definition of a close race to 10% or closer, it's only 16%, which tells us, if my math is right, 84% of the races in the last midterm cycle were decided not closely, right? So we can predict very well the vast majority of House races as a result. All right. Moving on, people are not political philosophers. For the most part, people have vague notions of political ideologies. Many of us are cross-pressured. That is to say, we have a mix of liberal or conservative attitudes. So thinking about polarization as a function of ideology misses all sorts of things. It's much more than that. Group loyalty matters a lot when it comes to position taking. It certainly matters a lot when it comes to party identification. And so what we're seeing is a convergence of ideological and partisan identities with other social identities that are reinforced, right, through various kinds of demographic phenomena, be it race or religion or class. And so this kind of is part of why in-group preference bias and out-group aversion are becoming so much worse. This is data that tells you something I'm sure at this point you already know. The Democratic Party is more racially diverse than the Republican Party. So you can see by 2019, what is that? Over 40% of the Democratic Party is non-white. 14% of the Republican Party is non-white. I was a little surprised by this. The Democratic Party is a little younger than the Republican Party, but not a lot. Not a whole lot. In 2019, 49% of the Democratic Party is under the age of 50, and on the Republican side, it's 42%. So then it is the Democratic Party is younger, but not dramatically younger. This is the share of Democratic voters and Republican voters who have college educations or postgraduate educations. And this, I think, is pretty interesting. So in 1996, 27% of Republicans had either a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, and only 22% of the Democratic Party had a college degree or a graduate degree. And that has shifted. So people with higher education degrees have begun to move into the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party has increased its share of college-educated voters, but only very, very slightly. This is, again, age, and it tells you, but that other set of data suggests that the Republican Party is a bit older, and Democratic Party is a bit younger. And then this perhaps is of interest given our venue, right? So the distribution of religion is quite a bit different. For the Democratic Party, the plurality of respondents is unaffiliated. And of course, if you add up those who ascribe to a particular religion. That is the majority, but it's nowhere near the majority that the Republican Party has. So that somebody who's ascribing to a religion in the Republican Party is 79% as opposed to 52% on the Democratic side. Why does that matter? Well, different denominations seem to be correlated with different values that have political implication. And so this is a bit of data put together by the Public Religion Research Institute, published in 2020. And it asks Americans their willingness to agree with the following statements. That immigrants threaten traditional American customs and values, as indicated by the green bar. 39% of Americans said they agreed with that statement. And then the turquoise kind of colored bar indicates agreement with the following statement: immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. And 36% of Americans agreed with that. Big partisan differences there, right? So for Republicans, the percentages of people who agreed with those statements, 70% and 63%. And for Democrats, it was only 20% agreeing with each of those statements. And then if we break it down, as the PRRI folks did by religious affiliation, you can see that the biggest support amongst those with a religious perspective is white evangelical Protestants, and white evangelical Protestants now have become some of the strongest supporters of the Republican Party, and part of that seems to be, anyway, given the data demonstrated here and in other places, a fear that the culture is changing in ways that are problematic from their value system. And so, again, that's true of concerns around immigration, but also around sexual orientation. I'm going to move forward. I don't know if you've heard of the Cracker Barrel gap. The Cracker Barrel gap explains presidential vote choice pretty good. Biden won 85% of counties in the country with a Whole Foods market, but only 32% of counties with a Cracker Barrel country market. That gap has grown significantly. From 1992, that gap was only 19%, but in 2020, it was 53%. What's going on there? Why does this matter? I mean, it might be somewhat humorous, but it really does reflect the degree to which our politics is infusing itself in all sorts of kind of non-political forms of life, right? Like, where do you do your grocery shopping? What kinds of foods do you buy? In 2016, I saw, again, a slightly humorous paper talking about how successful it was to predict support for Hillary Clinton in the presidential election simply by knowing whether or not a voter had eaten Indian food in the previous 12 months. This shows that our political identities are overlapping and melding with our consumer identities, with our behaviors and habits outside of the political realm. Again, intensifying in-group and out-group biases. So this affective polarization and identity politics is playing out in a dynamic cultural landscape. We get increasing racial and ethnic diversity, increasing religious diversity, but also a growth in secularization, increasing openness to sexual and gender minorities, new gender roles as women and girls begin to outperform boys and men in education, and increasingly are breaking glass ceilings. This is affecting people differently, and people are taking different perspectives on all of these things. And here's where I want to shift to economics. And for the way in which economics plays out on this, I'm persuaded by the research by Ronald Engelhardt, University of Michigan. Actually, he just passed away in 2021, and Pippin Norris at Harvard. And they have a long collaborative research partnership in which they find that there is a pretty strong relationship between social tolerance in a society and the degree of economic inequality or equality in society. And so essentially, as economic inequality grows, that intensifies social intolerance as people on the losing end of the economic change, right, perceive themselves to be in an increasingly competitive environment with immigrants and other persons jockeying for position on the socioeconomic ladder. And so their research spans not just the United States, but they've done a lot of research in Europe as well, and they find strong support for rising levels of social intolerance being driven by rising levels of economic inequality. And so when we recognize the fact that polarization is increasingly a problem for the United States, it's not limited to the United States. It is a global factor, right? And so the effects of globalization, which have improved income and wealth in the professional classes in rich developed countries, has shifted manufacturing to emerging economies, which has an impact on the nature of the economies in the developed world. And that has resulted in low wage growth or no wage growth, depending upon particular fields of manual labor. Women are entering the workforce, the rights of racial minorities and the LGBT community are advancing. You have high rates of immigration, and you have declining well-being in certain kinds of blue-collar white communities. And so if you look at marriage rates, divorce rates, substance abuse rates, life expectancy, all of these kind of key indicators of well-being are on the decline in many communities, but particularly in white blue-collar communities in the United States. And so that level of kind of, you could call it health and economic status, is amplifying a kind of intolerance on a number of political values. So what we were seeing also a lot of democratic backsliding around the world. Democratic backsliding just means systems are becoming less democratic. The 20th century was a century of overwhelming democratization. At the beginning of the 20th century, no country in the world would have qualified as a democracy from our kind of very contemporary and rigorous definition of what a democracy should be. Given the refusal of countries to extend the franchise on the basis of race and gender at the beginning of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, billions of people lived around the world in places that had significant expansion of political and human rights and so forth. But the 21st century seems to be reversing that, and so we're getting a decline in democracy in a number of places. And so the turquoise-colored band there is a stable democracy, and you can see it's declining. This is research put together by the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Of 104 democratic states, they found 14 are expanding, 42 are stable, 37 are moderately contracting, and 11 are severely contracting. And so if we think about a kind of continuum of political systems, move away from a kind of binary systems are either democratic or non-democratic. There are a couple of categories in between those that are worth paying attention to, given the shift in democratic backsliding in the world today. And so you can have a liberal democratic system in which the electoral system is functioning fine, in which political tolerance is high, there's rule of law, people accept it, and there is integrity in the administrative bureaucratic agencies. A step away from that towards a more authoritarian end would include elections that are functioning, but they're kind of minimally functioning. There's some problems with accountability and integrity in the system, and there's rising levels of political intolerance and possible sporadic violence. And then there are going to be authoritarian systems that are still competitive in terms of their election systems. They have elections, but the elections themselves are highly problematic, and there's not a really good chance for multiple parties to have a reasonable expectation of winning. The party in control can pay enough attention and manipulate the elections such that they get the appearance of democracy even though there is a significant amount of disproportionate power in the hands of a relative few. And then, of course, there's just closed authoritarian systems. And it's worth noting that political scientists find that it's this interim state of between a kind of minimal democracy and complete authoritarianism that is the most dangerous. That is where the most violence takes place. In a closed authoritarian system in which one party has dominant control, there's not much violence because the state has a tight grip on the government and on the population. And so when we look at trends, this is data put together by the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg. They find toxic polarization worsening around the world. In 2011, there were 5 countries that met their definition. By 2021, there were 32 countries. The number of countries threatening freedom of expression, 5 in 2011. In 2021, it was 35. In the share of the world's population living in autocracies, 49% in 2011, bumping up significantly by 2021. To the extent that they're right, this is very, very disturbing data. And there is a connection between polarization and democratic backsliding. As electorate splits, the stakes of electoral victory increase, as does holding on to government. This incentivizes undemocratic, illiberal tactics like gerrymandering, vote suppression, political intimidation, and violence, the curtailment of official powers of offices that do get lost, and hard and soft forms of demagoguery, the point of which is to divide us up in order to strengthen one's own base of support and legitimize more extreme tactics. Are there solutions to this? Well, I mean, I think there are. But it's tricky, right? There's a tricky balance between defending democracy, individual rights of vulnerable populations, and facilitating social change where justice calls for it, and repairing political divides. So how do we do that? Well, carefully and cautiously, I think, is the answer. Increasing the well-being of all groups, however, all groups, reducing economic inequalities, particularly those for whom college education has been out of reach, will increase the likelihood of greater social tolerance and diffuse the culture war. And of course, some kind of improved focus on common interests, which is difficult, right? If epistemic crises preclude agreement over the indicative, factual circumstances we find ourselves in. Thank you. Happy to respond to any questions or comments that you might have.
I've got a microphone here. There's another one up here. I mean, I think Dr. Mast has done an incredible job of keeping things at that fact level amidst a topic that is necessarily so often incendiary. So very grateful for that. Why don't we try to continue that spirit for our last 5 minutes as we get up to ask questions. I know there's a lot of passion in the room, but if we can be as generous and rational as possible as we ask our questions, that would be great. So who's got one? Stoned into silence. Here you go.
There you go. Yeah. One of the things you pointed out was the relationship, the feeling about the foreigner coming in and upending the economic system. And when I look back at history, I think that's always been with us. Even in the late 1700s in Philadelphia, they were complaining there were too many German language papers because the Germans were flooding this English enclave. And I was wondering, do you know anything about that, and whether that was just the fact that they were a different language, or was there an economic component to that?
I'm guessing, I'm speculating, but my guess would be that if we could go back to that period of time and poll people, that people higher up the economic income ladder would be less concerned about all those German immigrants than the people who are competing with them. Certainly, I know a fair bit about the history of the labor movement in the United States, and there was lots and lots of tension between Serbian miners and Croat miners and Polish miners and so forth. And so one of the big challenges associated with labor organizations was to get people to look past the fact that they're coming from a different country, that they have different religious perspectives, and to recognize that your real kind of common interest that you got to focus on here is to not die in the mine next week, and to get a decent wage so that you don't have to work until you can't stand up anymore, or you can't breathe. So, I mean, I do think that there is this clear economic dimension to our willingness to put up with difference. So, Abraham Maslow, famous anthropologist, argues that there's this hierarchy of needs, and that you're going to be more open to different interpretations of what gender is if you're not worried about being evicted next week, or if you're not worried about having to feed your kids. And with material comfort comes, at least it seems to be, that there is this willingness to become a little bit more generous or open to social or cultural change.
Thank you. This was fabulous. When you think about ways that we're trying to solve for economic inequality, I noticed it talks about college education, but one of the things I think we're starting to realize that we have to open up more opportunities for things other than college education.
Absolutely.
Was there something in the research that pinpointed college education, or would you say it's probably a little bit older and really it's any form of post-secondary opportunities that we're providing for all people?
Yeah, for the social science research, typically you're just using the most convenient metric to measure something richer and more complicated, and so they're looking at, does the person you're asking questions of have a college degree or not? Education itself is far more complicated. We all know more educated people who don't have a college degree than some people who do have a college degree. There's no guarantee that the piece of paper will make you educated, for sure. I agree very much on the point about trying to expand opportunity for people who don't go and get college degrees. Imagine yourself in a very, very rural town in Wisconsin. I myself lived in a trailer park for 7 years, and after that I moved into a manufactured home in the countryside, surrounded by farmers who were scraping by. So, I mean, I do have a kind of personal, I feel personal and emotional connection to small rural life in this state. But if you think about what life is like in those countries, in those communities rather, you have a fact of your brightest, most ambitious young people are going off to college. They're moving to some other place to go to college, and they're unlikely to come back. And so it's not hard to see where some kind of antipathy on the part of people living in these communities towards higher education comes from. Never mind the fact that the culture is changing in a way that calls into question all sorts of assumptions about God, about men and women, about sexuality, and so forth, that are new and unfamiliar to these folks. And so, it's a challenge. There's no doubt. It's a real challenge.
All right, let's have one more question, and then we'll let him go.
This won't take long, I promise. I see the diversification, the numbers that you presented, and how they've increased over time. What kind of numbers exist for a third party, something that would fill that gap?
Right. Yeah, great question. And there's just no real chance of a third party. I mean, so the last, my field, political science, has very, very, very few laws, unlike physics. We have one. It's Duverger's law. Duverger's law says that in an electoral system that has plurality rules and single-member districts, you get two viable parties and not more than that. And the answer to why is that a vote for a third party always hurts the major party most like it, right? And so, I mean, which Americans want a viable, active Green Party candidate in the 2024 race. Republicans want that. Who wants a big, strong, vocal libertarian candidate in the 2024 race? Democrats want that because it would hurt the party most like the party in question. And so there's a strong disincentive to vote for a third party as a result. And so, I mean, the last time a third party candidate won the White House was, anybody know? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. And the victory of the Republican Party in that presidential race had the effect of sending the Whigs to a well-deserved political death. So the system kind of corrected itself. In the middle of the 19th century, the parties could make a mistake in that regard and allow for an insurgency candidate to come up because the only way to know what public really thinks is to, there's no surveying of the public in the middle of the 19th century. You got to talk to people one-on-one, and that allows for the parties to miscalculate the distribution of opinion in a way that's just not possible today. So, there's all sorts of reasons to lament the parties we have, but they're the parties we have. They are changeable, though. The parties are very changeable. I think you can look at Donald Trump's emergence as having a profound effect on the Republican Party, from my perspective, good and bad. And so the parties can change. All right, thanks.
Again.
Good luck to us all. You bet.